In the annals of military history, there are shots that defy physics, moments that challenge human capability, and legends born from impossible circumstances. Today, we're diving into one such story, a tale of precision, desperation, and a single bullet that traveled further than anyone thought possible. This is the story of Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez, whose legendary sniper shot from 4,000 meters away didn't just break records. It saved an entire platoon trapped in what military tacticians call the kill zone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 2019, and the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan's Kunar province had become a graveyard for coalition forces. The Taliban had transformed these ancient peaks into a labyrinth of death, using the natural geography to their advantage. Every valley was a potential ambush site, every ridge a sniper's nest, every shadow a hiding place for an enemy that knew these mountains like their own backyard. It was in this unforgiving landscape that Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez would etch her name into military legend with a shot that experts still debate today. Elena wasn't your typical soldier. Born in El Paso, Texas, to a family of Mexican immigrants, she had grown up with a rifle in her hands, hunting deer in the Chihuahuan desert with her grandfather. Her natural talent for marksmanship became apparent early. At age 12, she could hit a playing card at 200 yards with her grandfather's old Winchester. But it wasn't just her natural ability that set her apart, it was her mathematical mind. While other kids struggled with algebra, Elena was calculating wind drift, bullet drop, and atmospheric pressure in her head. By the time she enlisted in the Army at 18, Elena had already won 3 state-level shooting competitions. The military recognized her talent immediately, fast-tracking her through sniper school, where she graduated at the top of her class. Her instructors noted not just her exceptional accuracy, but her ability to remain calm under pressure, a quality that would prove invaluable in the mountains of Afghanistan. The mission that would make Elena famous began like so many others in that war-torn region. Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment, was conducting a routine patrol in the Korengal Valley when they received intelligence about a high-value target hiding in a Taliban compound deep in the mountains. The HVT, codenamed Viper, was believed to be responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition convoys throughout the region. Taking him out would significantly disrupt Taliban operations in the area. The compound sat on a rocky outcropping roughly 15 kilometers from the nearest coalition base, surrounded by steep cliffs and accessible only by a narrow mountain path. It was the perfect defensive position, isolated, easily defended, and with clear sight lines in all directions. Any approaching force would be visible for miles, giving the defenders ample time to prepare. It was exactly the kind of target that required surgical precision rather than brute force. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Kane, the battalion commander, assembled a small team. The plan was simple in concept, but challenging in execution. A reconnaissance team would establish overwatch positions, while a smaller assault team moved in to capture or eliminate the target. Elena was assigned to the Overwatch team, positioned on a ridge approximately 2,000 meters from the target compound, well within the effective range of her M24 sniper weapon system. The team inserted under cover of darkness using night vision and thermal imaging to navigate the treacherous mountain terrain. Elena's spotter, Jake Morrison, was a veteran of 2 previous deployments who had earned a reputation for his ability to read environmental conditions. Together, they had completed dozens of successful missions, their partnership honed by months of training and combat experience. As dawn broke over the Hindu Kush Mountains, the team was in position. Elena lay prone on the rocky ridge, her rifle trained on the compound below. Through her scope, she could see movement in the courtyard, figures moving between buildings, guards taking positions along the walls. The intelligence had been accurate. The compound was definitely occupied, and the level of security suggested that someone important was indeed inside. The assault team began their approach, moving carefully along the mountain path. Everything seemed to be going according to plan until the inevitable happened in that unforgiving landscape. They walked into an ambush. Taliban fighters concealed in caves and crevices along the path opened fire with AK-47s and RPGs. Within seconds, what had been a carefully planned operation became a desperate fight for survival. From her vantage point on the ridge, Elena watched in horror as her fellow soldiers dove for cover behind rocks and fallen trees. The Taliban had chosen their ambush site perfectly. The narrow path offered no escape routes, and the steep terrain made it impossible for the trapped soldiers to advance or retreat. They were caught in what military tacticians call a kill zone, a carefully prepared area where the enemy has overlapping fields of fire and the advantage of superior positioning. The radio crackled with desperate voices as the ambush unfolded. "Taking heavy fire, request immediate support," came the voice of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the team leader. Elena could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions, the Taliban fighters having positioned themselves in a semicircle around the narrow path. Her fellow soldiers were pinned down behind inadequate cover, unable to move without exposing themselves to devastating crossfire. Elena immediately began engaging targets within her range, her M24 barking as she methodically eliminated Taliban fighters one by one. Each shot was carefully calculated, accounting for wind speed, temperature, and the extreme elevation difference between her position and the targets below. Her spotter, Corporal Morrison, fed her target information while coordinating with the trapped assault team. 200 meters, bearing 045, machine gun nest, Morrison called out. Elena adjusted her aim and fired, the 7.62 millimeter round finding its mark and silencing the machine gun that had been raking the path with deadly fire. But for every Taliban fighter they eliminated, 2 more seemed to take their place. It became clear that the intelligence had been wrong. This wasn't just a compound housing a single high-value target, but a major Taliban stronghold with dozens of fighters. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Private First Class Tommy Chin, the team's medic, was hit in the shoulder while trying to reach a wounded comrade. Sergeant Rodriguez took shrapnel from an RPG that detonated against the rocks above their position. The team's radio operator, Specialist Maria Santos, was calling for air support, but the mountainous terrain and adverse weather conditions made it impossible for helicopters to reach them. "Storms moving in from the west," Morrison observed, pointing to the dark clouds gathering over the mountain peaks. "We've got maybe 30 minutes before this ridge becomes invisible." The approaching weather system would not only limit visibility, but also create dangerous wind conditions that would make accurate shooting nearly impossible. Elena continued to engage targets, but she was fighting a losing battle. The Taliban fighters were well entrenched in positions that had been prepared over months or even years. They had clear fields of fire, abundant ammunition, and the tactical advantage of fighting from prepared positions. Her fellow soldiers, caught in the open on the narrow mountain path, were slowly being overwhelmed. It was then that Elena noticed something that chilled her blood. Through her scope, she could see additional Taliban fighters moving along a ridge on the far side of the valley, reinforcements arriving to finish off the trapped American soldiers. These new fighters were carrying heavy weapons, mortars, RPGs, and what appeared to be a Russian-made Dragunov sniper rifle. Once they reached their positions, the trapped assault team would be completely surrounded with no hope of escape. "Morrison, you seeing this?" Elena asked, her voice tight with concern. Her spotter adjusted his binoculars and cursed under his breath. "Yeah, I see them. Looks like at least a squad, maybe more. They'll have overwatch on our guys in about 10 minutes. Elena quickly calculated distances and angles. The reinforcing Taliban fighters were moving along a ridge approximately 4,000 meters away, well beyond the effective range of her M24 rifle. The maximum effective range of the M24 system was generally considered to be around 800 meters, though exceptional marksmen had made successful shots at greater distances. But 4,000 meters? That was entering the realm of the impossible. At such an extreme distance, a bullet would take nearly 6 seconds to reach its target, during which time gravity would cause it to drop over 200 feet. Wind conditions would affect the trajectory unpredictably, and the curvature of the Earth itself would begin to factor into the calculations. It was the kind of shot that existed only in theory, discussed in advanced ballistics courses as an academic exercise rather than a practical possibility. But Elena wasn't thinking about textbook limitations. She was watching her brothers and sisters in arms being systematically destroyed by an enemy that showed no mercy. The approaching Taliban reinforcements would seal their fate, turning what was already a desperate situation into a massacre. Someone had to stop those reinforcements, and she was the only one in position to try. She began running calculations in her head, drawing on years of training and experience. Wind speed at her position was approximately 15 miles per hour from the west, but at 4,000 meters, the bullet would pass through multiple wind layers, each with different speeds and directions. The temperature differential between her position and the target area would affect bullet velocity. The extreme angle of the shot, she was firing down into the valley and then up to the opposite ridge, would create additional complications. Morrison was already ahead of her, using his range-finding equipment to get precise distance measurements. 4,030 meters, he reported. Winds variable, gusting up to 25. Temperature differential is about 15 degrees. Elena adjusted her scope and set the elevation far beyond anything she had ever attempted in training or combat. The mathematics were staggering. She would need to aim approximately 40 feet above her target to account for bullet drop. At that distance, her target would appear as little more than a speck through her scope, barely distinguishable from the rocks and vegetation surrounding it. The trapped assault team was running low on ammunition. Their calls for support were becoming increasingly desperate as the Taliban fighters pressed their attack. Elena could see Taliban fighters moving closer to her trapped comrades, using the cover of rocks and trees to advance their positions. Time was running out. She selected her target, the leader of the reinforcing Taliban fighters, identifiable by his position at the front of the group and the way the others looked to him for direction. Taking out the leader might cause confusion and delay their advance, buying precious time for her trapped assault team. She settled into her firing position, controlling her breathing and letting her heart rate slow. At this distance, even the slightest tremor could send the bullet wildly off target. She had to become perfectly still, perfectly calm, despite the chaos unfolding around her. Through her scope, Elena could barely make out the figure of the Taliban leader moving along the distant ridge. At 4,000 meters, he appeared as little more than a dark speck against the rocky mountainside, occasionally disappearing behind outcroppings before reappearing moments later. The mathematical challenge before her was staggering. She was attempting something that pushed the very boundaries of physics and human capability. Morrison was working frantically with his range-finding equipment and weather monitoring devices, gathering every piece of data that might help Elena make the impossible shot. Barometric pressure is 26.8 inches, he reported. Humidity at 62%. Wind direction is shifting. We've got crosswinds from multiple directions. Elena's mind became a calculating machine, processing variables that most people couldn't even comprehend. At 4,000 meters, her 7.62 millimeter bullet would lose significant velocity due to air resistance, dropping its speed from the muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second to approximately 1,200 feet per second by the time it reached the target. This dramatic velocity loss would affect not just the trajectory, but also the bullet's ability to maintain stability in flight. The Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth itself, would also come into play at such an extreme distance. Firing from north to south in the northern hemisphere would cause the bullet to drift slightly to the right, an effect that was negligible at normal shooting distances, but significant at 4,000 meters. Elena had studied this phenomenon in advanced ballistics courses, but she had never had to account for it in an actual combat situation. Wind was perhaps the most challenging variable. At normal shooting distances, wind conditions could be observed and accounted for relatively easily. But at 4,000 meters, the bullet would pass through multiple atmospheric layers, each potentially having different wind speeds and directions.
A bullet fired in a 15-mile-per-hour crosswind at Elena's position might encounter completely different conditions halfway to the target. Elena made minute adjustments to her scope, cranking an elevation that seemed almost absurd. She was essentially aiming at empty sky, trusting in mathematics and physics to bring her bullet down to Earth at precisely the right moment and location. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. A miscalculation of even a few inches could result in a complete miss. The situation below was deteriorating rapidly. Elena could see through her scope that one of the trapped soldiers, it looked like Private Chen, the medic, was motionless behind a rock. Whether he was wounded, unconscious, or worse, she couldn't tell from her position. The Taliban fighters were pressing their advantage, moving closer to the trapped Americans while maintaining heavy suppressing fire. The approaching reinforcements were now clearly visible on the distant ridge, and Elena could see that her assessment had been accurate. They were carrying heavy weapons that would seal the fate of the trapped assault team. The leader she had selected as her target was gesturing to his men, apparently coordinating their final approach to their firing positions. Elena's breathing became controlled and rhythmic, a technique drilled into her through hundreds of hours of training. In between heartbeats, when her body was at its stillest, she would have a fraction of a second window for the perfect shot. But at 4,000 meters, even perfect technique might not be enough. Morrison continued feeding her information, his voice calm despite the desperate situation. Target is moving left to right approximately 2 miles per hour. Wind gust coming up, wait for it to settle. Okay, wind is steadying at 18 miles per hour from 270. Elena made final adjustments, accounting for the target's movement and the wind conditions. She would need to lead the target significantly, aiming well ahead of where he currently stood to account for the bullet's 6-second flight time. If the Taliban leader maintained his current pace and direction, and if all her calculations were correct, the bullet should intercept him just as he reached the firing position that would allow his team to destroy the trapped Americans. The crosshairs in her scope were trained on what appeared to be empty air, 40 feet above and 20 feet to the left of the target. To any observer, it would have looked like she was aiming at nothing. But Elena trusted her calculations, trusted her training, and trusted in the desperate mathematics that represented the only hope for her trapped comrades. Below in the valley, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio. "We're almost out of ammo. If anyone can do anything, now would be the time." The desperation in his voice was clear, and Elena knew that within minutes, the Taliban would overrun their positions. She took one final breath, let half of it out, and felt her heartbeat slow to its natural rhythm. Between one heartbeat and the next, in that moment of perfect stillness that every sniper knows, Elena Vasquez squeezed the trigger of her M24 rifle and sent a single bullet on a trajectory that would either save 8 American soldiers or disappear harmlessly into the vast emptiness of the Afghan mountains. The rifle's sharp crack echoed off the surrounding peaks, and the bullet began its incredible journey through the thin mountain air. At 2,650 feet per second initial velocity, it streaked toward a target so distant it was barely visible, carrying with it the hopes and prayers of everyone watching the drama unfold in the kill zone below.
Time seemed suspended as Elena's bullet began its impossible journey across the 4,000 meters of Afghan mountain air. 6 seconds. That's how long physics dictated it would take for the 175-grain projectile to cover the distance, assuming her calculations were correct. 6 seconds during which gravity would pull the bullet down over 200 feet, wind would push it off course by unpredictable amounts, and the very rotation of the Earth would exert its subtle influence on the trajectory. Elena kept her rifle steady, watching through her scope as the distant Taliban leader continued his movement along the ridge. Morrison was beside her, binoculars trained on the same area, both of them knowing that they wouldn't see the bullet's impact immediately. At that distance, it would take the sound of the shot several additional seconds to travel back to their position, if they could hear it at all over the wind and ongoing firefight. "Time," Morrison whispered, marking the seconds on his watch. The bullet should have been roughly halfway to its target, passing through different atmospheric layers, fighting against air resistance that was slowing it down with every meter traveled. Elena had calculated that the bullet would lose nearly 1,500 feet per second of velocity during its flight, arriving at the target with just enough energy to be lethal, if it arrived at all. Down in the valley, the trapped soldiers were fighting for their lives with increasing desperation. Ammunition was running critically low, and the Taliban fighters were pressing their advantage, moving from cover to cover as they closed the distance to the trapped Americans. Elena could see muzzle slashes from the enemy positions, could see her comrades returning fire with decreasing frequency as their ammunition dwindled. Private Chen, the medic, was definitely down. Elena could see him lying motionless behind a large boulder, his medical bag scattered nearby where he had dropped it while trying to reach a wounded soldier. Sergeant Rodriguez was still coordinating the defense, but Elena could hear the strain in his voice over the radio as he tried to manage an increasingly hopeless situation. 4 seconds, Morrison counted. The bullet would be entering its final approach now, following a trajectory that curved downward like an artillery shell rather than the relatively flat path of a normal sniper shot. At this point, if Elena's calculations were correct, the bullet would be about 40 feet above the target, beginning its final descent toward the Taliban leader's position. The approaching storm was making visibility increasingly difficult. Dark clouds were rolling over the mountain peaks, and Elena could feel the first drops of rain beginning to fall. In minutes, the entire operation would be shrouded in weather that would make any kind of long-range shooting impossible. This shot, this impossible, desperate attempt, might be their only chance. Elena's training kicked in automatically. Even while watching for the impact of her shot, she was already working the bolt of her M24, chambering another round in case she needed to take a follow-up shot. But she knew that if this bullet missed its target, there wouldn't be time for another attempt at 4,000 meters. The Taliban reinforcements would reach their positions, and the mathematics of the battlefield would shift decisively in favor of the enemy. 5 seconds, Morrison whispered. Elena held her breath, knowing that in one more second, her bullet would either find its target or disappear harmlessly into the mountainside. Everything they had worked for, all the training and preparation and expertise that had brought them to this moment, would be proven either adequate or insufficient. Through her scope, Elena watched the Taliban leader reach the exact spot where her calculations had predicted he would be when the bullet completed its 6-second flight. He was raising what appeared to be binoculars to his eyes, probably surveying the trapped American soldiers and planning the final assault that would destroy them. In that moment, he represented not just a military target, but the key to saving 8 American lives. 6, Morrison counted, and Elena strained her eyes through the scope, searching for any sign of impact at the impossible distance. The target area was so far away that even with her high-powered scope, details were difficult to make out. Had the bullet found its mark? Had it sailed harmlessly past? At this distance and in these conditions, even Elena's exceptional vision might not be sufficient to confirm a hit. Then Morrison's voice cut through the tension. "Holy shit, Elena, you got him!" Even with his high-powered binoculars, Morrison could barely make out what had happened on the distant ridge, but the evidence was clear. The Taliban leader had dropped out of sight, and the organized movement of his reinforcements had suddenly become chaotic. Elena trained her scope on the area, trying to confirm what Morrison was seeing. The mathematics had worked. Against all odds, through a combination of skill, calculation, and perhaps divine intervention, Elena's bullet had traveled 4,000 meters and found its target. The Taliban leader was down, and his men were clearly confused and disorganized by the sudden loss of their commander. But there was no time for celebration. The immediate threat of the reinforcements had been neutralized, but the trapped assault team was still in desperate trouble. Elena immediately shifted her attention back to the ongoing firefight in the valley, searching for targets within the more manageable range of her rifle. "Rodriguez, this is Vasquez. Reinforcements neutralized. I'm engaging targets in your immediate area." Sergeant Rodriguez's voice crackled back, filled with amazement and hope. "Vasquez, I don't know what the hell you just did, but these guys on the ridge just scattered. Keep doing whatever you're doing." Elena began systematically engaging Taliban fighters who were pressing the attack on her trapped comrades. At distances of 800 to 1,200 meters, her shots were more conventional, though still challenging given the mountainous terrain and deteriorating weather conditions. Each shot was carefully aimed and deliberate, designed to relieve pressure on specific points where the Taliban attack was most intense.
Morrison continued to spot targets and provide environmental data, his training and experience making him an invaluable partner in the deadly business of long-range precision fire. Together, they began to systematically dismantle the Taliban ambush, picking off key fighters and forcing others to abandon their positions. The weather was deteriorating rapidly now, with rain beginning to fall more heavily and visibility dropping significantly. Elena knew they had only minutes before conditions would make accurate shooting impossible. She had to make every shot count, had to use these precious few minutes to create an opportunity for the trapped soldiers to either advance on their objectives or withdraw to safety. Through her scope, Elena could see that her efforts were having an effect. The Taliban fighters, who had been confident and aggressive just minutes earlier, were now clearly rattled. The loss of their reinforcements and the ongoing precision fire from Elena's position had disrupted their tactical plan and forced them to focus on survival rather than overwhelming the trapped Americans.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The tactical situation in the valley was shifting moment by moment. Elena's impossible 4,000-meter shot had eliminated the Taliban leader commanding the reinforcements, but the immediate threat to the trapped assault team remained critical. She could see through her scope that the enemy fighters, though rattled by the loss of their approaching support, were still maintaining their positions and continuing to pour fire into the area where her fellow soldiers were pinned down. Elena methodically worked her way through the Taliban positions, prioritizing targets based on their threat level to the trapped Americans. A machine gun nest that had been raking the path with devastating crossfire became her first priority. The gunner was positioned behind a rocky outcropping approximately 900 meters away, well within the effective range of her M24 rifle. She adjusted her scope for the shorter distance, accounting for the wind conditions and the angle of the shot. The target was partially concealed, with only his head and shoulders visible above the rocks. At 900 meters, this was still a challenging shot, but it was conventional marksmanship compared to the miracle she had just accomplished at 4,000 meters. Elena controlled her breathing, found the natural pause between heartbeats, and squeezed the trigger. The machine gun fell silent, its operator eliminated by a single, precise shot. Immediately, she could hear the change in the volume of fire directed at the trapped soldiers. Removing that machine gun had eliminated a significant source of the suppressing fire that was keeping them pinned down. Morrison was already identifying the next target. 11 o'clock, approximately 1,100 meters, looks like a sniper with a Dragunov, he reported. Elena could see the distinctive outline of the Russian-made rifle through her scope, its operator apparently trying to engage the trapped Americans from a concealed position among the rocks. This was a battle between snipers now, a deadly game of hide-and-seek where the first person to reveal their position would likely be the last. Elena had the advantage of superior optics and a better understanding of ballistics, but the Taliban sniper knew the terrain intimately and had the benefit of prepared positions. Elena took her time with this shot, knowing that eliminating the enemy sniper would significantly reduce the threat to her trapped comrades. She could see him adjusting his position, probably trying to get a clear shot at one of the Americans. Through her scope, Elena could make out details of his equipment and positioning that would help her calculate the precise shot placement needed to neutralize the threat. The wind had picked up significantly, and rain was beginning to affect visibility. Elena had to factor in not just the wind's speed and direction, but also the way the rain might affect her bullet's trajectory over the 1,100-meter distance. Moisture in the air would create additional drag, potentially affecting both velocity and accuracy. She made her final adjustments and fired. Through her scope, Elena saw the enemy sniper's rifle tumble down the rocky slope, its operator no longer a threat to anyone. The elimination of the Taliban's precision shooter further degraded their ability to maintain effective fire on the trapped assault team. The radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice. "Vasquez, whatever you're doing up there, it's working. We're getting ready to move. Can you provide covering fire?" Elena acknowledged the request and began engaging targets of opportunity, forcing Taliban fighters to keep their heads down while the trapped soldiers attempted to improve their tactical position. She could see her comrades moving carefully from cover to cover, no longer completely pinned down by overwhelming enemy fire.
Morrison was tracking multiple targets simultaneously, calling out positions and priorities based on their immediate threat to the moving Americans. 2 o'clock, 750 meters, 3 fighters behind the large boulder, he reported. Elena quickly acquired the targets and engaged, her shots forcing the Taliban fighters to abandon their position and seek cover elsewhere. The approaching storm was making long-range shooting increasingly difficult. Visibility was dropping rapidly, and the wind was becoming erratic and unpredictable. Elena knew that her window for providing effective support was closing quickly. She had to make every shot count while conditions still permitted accurate fire. Through her scope, she could see that Private Chen, the medic who had been hit earlier, was being moved by his fellow soldiers. It appeared that he was alive, but wounded, being carried by 2 other members of the assault team as they attempted to reach a more defensible position. Elena immediately shifted her fire to protect the soldiers who were exposed while helping their wounded comrade. A group of Taliban fighters was attempting to flank the Americans' new position, moving along a ridge that would give them a clear shot at the soldiers carrying Chen. Elena engaged them at a distance of approximately 850 meters, forcing them to abandon their flanking maneuver and seek cover elsewhere. The tide of battle was definitely turning. What had been a hopeless situation for the trapped assault team was becoming a fighting withdrawal, with Elena's precision fire providing the crucial support they needed to extract themselves from the kill zone. The Taliban fighters, who had been confident of victory just minutes earlier, were now struggling to maintain their own positions under the constant threat of accurate long-range fire. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio again. "Vasquez, we're moving to extract point Alpha. Can you cover our withdrawal?" Elena confirmed, knowing that extract point Alpha was a landing zone approximately 2 kilometers from their current position, where helicopters could potentially land to evacuate the team. Covering their withdrawal would mean engaging targets at varying distances as the team moved through the mountainous terrain, all while dealing with deteriorating weather conditions. She began systematically suppressing Taliban positions along the route the assault team would need to take, forcing enemy fighters to keep their heads down and preventing them from organizing an effective pursuit. Each shot had to be carefully considered, as ammunition was not unlimited and every round needed to serve a tactical purpose. Morrison was providing constant updates on weather conditions and target information. "Visibility dropping fast," he reported. "We've got maybe 5 more minutes of effective shooting conditions." Elena nodded, understanding that she had to make these final minutes count. The assault team was moving through the most dangerous part of their withdrawal route, an open area where they would be exposed to fire from multiple directions. Her covering fire would be crucial to their survival during this vulnerable phase of the extraction.
The weather was rapidly becoming Elena's greatest enemy. What had started as scattered clouds and light rain was now developing into a full mountain storm, with visibility dropping dramatically and wind conditions becoming chaotic and unpredictable. Through her scope, targets that had been clearly visible just minutes earlier were now obscured by sheets of rain and swirling mist. Elena continued to provide covering fire for the withdrawing assault team, but each shot was becoming more challenging as environmental conditions deteriorated. The wind was gusting unpredictably, sometimes calm for a few seconds before suddenly shifting direction and intensity. Rain was beginning to accumulate on her scope lens, requiring constant clearing to maintain any kind of useful visibility. Morrison was doing his best to track targets and provide environmental data, but the storm was overwhelming his equipment's capabilities. "Wind direction is all over the place," he reported, "gusting from 15 to 35 miles per hour, multiple directions. I'm losing target acquisition." Through the chaos of the storm, Elena could see that the assault team was making progress toward extract point Alpha, but they were still vulnerable to pursuit by Taliban fighters who knew the terrain intimately. Several enemy fighters were attempting to follow the Americans' withdrawal route, moving in small groups and using the deteriorating weather as concealment. Elena engaged these pursuing fighters whenever she could acquire clear targets, but the storm was making accurate shooting extremely difficult.
Bullets that should have found their marks were being deflected by unpredictable wind conditions. Targets would appear briefly through breaks in the weather before disappearing again into the swirling mist and rain. The radio crackled with updates from the assault team. Chen's stable but needs immediate medical attention. We're 15 minutes from the extract point, but we've got pursuit. Rodriguez's voice was strained but determined, indicating that the team was holding together despite the desperate circumstances. Elena could see movement through her scope. Taliban fighters were definitely following the Americans' withdrawal route. She engaged them at every opportunity, but the storm was making it impossible to confirm hits or effectively suppress their movement. She was essentially firing blind, using her knowledge of the terrain and her experience with ballistics to make educated guesses about target locations. A brief break in the weather allowed Elena to acquire a clear target, a Taliban fighter armed with an RPG who was positioning himself to fire at the withdrawing Americans. At approximately 1,200 meters distance and in challenging wind conditions, it was exactly the kind of shot that separated expert marksmen from merely competent ones. Elena made rapid calculations, accounting for the gusty wind conditions and the target's movement. The Taliban fighter was clearly preparing to fire his RPG at the assault team, which would be catastrophic for the already wounded and exhausted soldiers. She had one clear shot before the weather closed in again. The crosshairs settled on the target, and Elena fired. Through her scope, she saw the Taliban fighter drop his weapon and fall backward, a clean hit that eliminated the immediate threat of the RPG attack. But almost immediately, the weather closed in again, reducing visibility to just a few hundred meters. Morrison was monitoring radio communications from the assault team and coordinating with helicopter support that was attempting to reach the extract point. Choppers are inbound, but they're fighting the same weather we are. Visibility at the landing zone is marginal. Elena continued to scan for targets through her scope, but the storm had essentially ended her ability to provide effective long-range support. The assault team would have to complete their withdrawal, relying on their own resources and the hope that helicopter evacuation would be possible despite the adverse weather conditions. The radio brought news that was both hopeful and concerning. Extract Point Alpha in sight, but we've got company. Taliban fighters are moving to intercept at the landing zone. Rodriguez's voice indicated that the team was approaching the final phase of their extraction, but it wouldn't be unopposed. Elena strained to see through the storm toward the extract point, knowing that it was beyond the range of effective fire in these conditions, but desperate to provide whatever support she could. Through brief breaks in the weather, she could occasionally glimpse the area where the helicopters would need to land, but details were impossible to make out. The sound of helicopter rotors became audible over the wind and rain, indicating that the extraction aircraft were approaching despite the challenging conditions. Elena knew that helicopter pilots flying in these mountains during a storm were taking enormous risks, but the alternative, leaving the assault team stranded with Taliban fighters in pursuit, was unacceptable. Morrison was coordinating with the helicopter crews via radio, providing what weather information he could gather from his position. Wind is gusting up to 40 miles per hour. Visibility at the extract point is less than 200 meters. Landing is going to be extremely hazardous. Elena continued to watch through her scope, ready to engage any targets that might threaten the extraction, but the weather was now so severe that she could barely see beyond a few hundred meters. The storm had essentially neutralized her ability to provide effective long-range support. The assault team would have to complete their withdrawal, relying on their own resources and the hope that helicopter evacuation would be possible despite the adverse weather conditions. The radio crackled with urgent communications. Taliban fighters approaching from the north. We need immediate suppression of that ridgeline. But Elena couldn't see the targets Rodriguez was describing, and even if she could, the wind conditions would make accurate shooting nearly impossible at any significant distance. She fired several shots in the direction Rodriguez had indicated, more in hope than expectation of hitting specific targets. At this distance and in these conditions, she was relying more on mathematical probability than precise marksmanship, but any harassment of enemy positions might help her trapped comrades. Morrison was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, trying to piece together the tactical situation from fragmentary reports. "Sounds like they've got heavy casualties," he reported grimly. "Chen's not the only one hit, and the choppers are taking fire every time they try to approach the LZ." The storm was reaching its peak intensity now, with wind speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour and visibility reduced to less than 50 meters in some areas. Elena had never operated in conditions this severe, and she was pushing the absolute limits of what was possible with her equipment and training. Through brief breaks in the weather, she caught occasional glimpses of muzzle flashes from the direction of the extract point, evidence that the firefight was continuing despite the terrible conditions. The Taliban fighters were pressing their attack, probably knowing that the storm provided them with cover from air support and long-range sniper fire. Elena continued to fire at estimated positions, using her knowledge of terrain and tactics to predict where enemy fighters might be positioned. Her shots were more psychological than physical at this point. The sound of incoming sniper fire, even inaccurate fire, could cause enemy soldiers to hesitate and take cover rather than pressing their attacks aggressively. The radio brought increasingly desperate updates. "Helicopter 1 is down. Repeat, Helicopter 1 is down. We need immediate support." Elena's heart sank as she realized that one of the extraction helicopters had been shot down, probably by the RPG fire she had been unable to suppress due to the weather conditions. Morrison was coordinating with the remaining helicopter and base operations, trying to organize additional support despite the severe limitations imposed by the storm. Second Bird is still airborne but taking heavy fire. They're trying to extract survivors from the first chopper. Elena made the decision that would define the rest of the operation. Despite the risks involved, she would have to move closer to the extraction point to provide effective support. Her current position, while safe and concealed, was simply too far away to influence the battle in these weather conditions. "We're moving," she announced to Morrison, beginning to pack her equipment despite the ongoing firefight. It was one of the most dangerous decisions a sniper could make, abandoning a prepared position during active combat. But the alternative was watching her fellow soldiers be overrun by Taliban fighters. Morrison immediately began gathering his gear, understanding that their survival now depended on reaching a position where Elena could provide effective fire support. The movement would expose them to detection and attack, but staying in their current location meant accepting the loss of the entire assault team. Elena slung her rifle and began moving through the storm toward the sound of firefight, knowing that she was leaving safety behind, but driven by the knowledge that 8 American soldiers needed her skills more than she needed her own security. The storm that had been her enemy was about to become her ally, providing concealment for a movement that would either save the mission or cost them all their lives.
The sounds of the firefight at the extract point were barely audible over the storm, but Elena could tell from radio communications that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The assault team had reached the landing zone, but Taliban fighters were closing in from multiple directions, and the helicopters were struggling to land in the severe weather conditions. "Taking heavy fire from the North Ridge!" Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio. "Choppers are taking hits! We need suppression on that position now!" Elena strained to see through the storm toward the area Rodriguez was describing, but visibility was virtually zero. The rain was falling in sheets now, driven by winds that were gusting over 40 miles per hour. Even with her high-powered scope, she couldn't make out individual targets at the distances involved. But Elena wasn't ready to give up. She had spent years training for exactly these kinds of impossible situations, learning to make shots that others considered beyond human capability. The storm might have reduced her effectiveness, but it hadn't eliminated it entirely. She began firing methodically at the area where intelligence and radio communications indicated Taliban positions, using her knowledge of terrain and ballistics to place harassing fire even when she couldn't see specific targets. Morrison was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, trying to coordinate between Elena's position, the assault team at the extract point, and the helicopter crews fighting to complete the evacuation. "First chopper is taking heavy fire," he reported. "They're trying to land, but the LZ is hot."
Elena could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors struggling against the wind, could hear the occasional burst of machine gun fire that indicated the aircraft were indeed under attack. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves well, using the natural terrain features around the landing zone to create overlapping fields of fire that threatened any aircraft attempting to land. She continued to fire at estimated Taliban positions, knowing that even if her shots weren't hitting specific targets, the incoming sniper fire would force enemy fighters to take cover and reduce the accuracy of their return fire. At distances approaching 1,500 meters in these weather conditions, Elena was essentially firing by mathematical calculation rather than direct observation. The radio brought increasingly desperate updates. "Chen's losing a lot of blood! We need immediate evacuation!" The wounded medic's condition was apparently deteriorating, making rapid extraction even more critical. Every minute of delay increased the risk that they would lose him despite all their efforts to get him to safety. Elena made the decision to move closer to the extract point, despite the risks involved. Her current position provided excellent overwatch of the valley where the ambush had occurred, but it was too far from the landing zone to provide effective support in the current weather conditions. She would have to abandon her prepared position and move through enemy territory to get within effective range. "Morrison, we're moving," she announced, beginning to pack her equipment. Her spotter immediately understood the implications. They would be leaving their secure, concealed position to move through terrain that might be occupied by Taliban fighters, all while carrying the heavy sniper rifle and associated equipment that made rapid movement difficult. Morrison quickly gathered his gear, including the sensitive communications equipment that had been keeping them in contact with the assault team and helicopter support. Moving during a firefight was one of the most dangerous things a sniper team could do, as it exposed them to detection and attack while reducing their ability to provide effective fire support. Elena slung her rifle and began moving down from the ridge toward the extract point, using natural terrain features for concealment while maintaining as rapid a pace as possible. The storm actually provided some advantages for their movement, as the reduced visibility that hindered their shooting also made it more difficult for Taliban fighters to spot their approach. The terrain between their original position and the extract point was treacherous under the best of conditions, but the storm had made it genuinely hazardous. Rocks were slippery with rain, visibility was reduced to just a few meters in some areas, and the wind was strong enough to affect balance on the narrow mountain paths. Morrison stayed close behind Elena, both of them moving as quickly as safety permitted, while remaining alert for signs of enemy activity. They could hear the ongoing firefight at the landing zone growing closer as they approached, could hear the helicopters still struggling to complete the evacuation despite the hostile fire. After 15 minutes of dangerous movement through the storm, Elena found a position approximately 800 meters from the extract point that offered both concealment and clear fields of fire toward the Taliban positions that were threatening the helicopters. It wasn't ideal. The position was exposed to weather and didn't provide the kind of stable shooting platform she preferred, but it was within effective range even in these conditions. Elena quickly set up her rifle, using her pack as a stabilizing rest, while Morrison established communications with the assault team and helicopter crews. Through her scope, she could now make out details of the firefight that had been invisible from her previous position. The landing zone was chaos. 2 helicopters were on the ground, their rotors still turning as crew chiefs returned fire at Taliban positions in the surrounding hills. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different enemy positions, all of them directing fire at the aircraft and the soldiers attempting to board them. "I have eyes on the LZ," Elena reported over the radio. "Multiple enemy positions engaging the choppers. I'm taking them under fire." She immediately began engaging the most threatening Taliban positions, her shots now accurate and effective at the reduced distance. A machine gun nest that had been raking one of the helicopters with sustained fire fell silent after her first shot. A group of Taliban fighters attempting to flank the landing zone scattered when her bullets began impacting around their position. Morrison was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, trying to coordinate between Elena's position, the assault team at the extract point, and the helicopter crews fighting to complete the evacuation. "First chopper is taking heavy fire," he reported. "They're trying to land, but the LZ is hot."
The evacuation was proceeding, but not without cost. Elena could see through her scope that one of the helicopters had taken significant damage, with smoke trailing from its engine compartment and bullet holes visible in its fuselage. The aircraft was still flyable, but it was clear that the crew was pushing their luck by remaining on the ground in such a hostile environment. Elena continued to systematically eliminate Taliban positions that threatened the extraction, her shots now devastatingly accurate at the reduced distance and with improved visibility as she had moved closer to the action. Each Taliban fighter she eliminated reduced the threat to both the helicopters and the assault team, but new enemy positions seemed to appear as quickly as she could suppress the old ones. Morrison was monitoring radio communications and providing constant updates on the tactical situation. "First chopper is loaded with wounded," he reported. "They're preparing to lift off. Second bird is taking the rest of the team." Elena could see soldiers running toward the helicopters while crew chiefs provided covering fire with mounted machine guns. The scene was chaotic, but organized, with each person knowing exactly what they needed to do despite the dangerous conditions. She continued to provide precision fire support, eliminating threats as they appeared and ensuring that the Taliban fighters couldn't organize an effective counterattack. The first helicopter lifted off successfully, its rotor struggling against the storm winds as it gained altitude and turned toward the coalition base. Elena watched it disappear into the storm, knowing that Private Chen and the other wounded soldiers were finally on their way to medical treatment. But the second aircraft was still on the ground, and Taliban fighters were intensifying their efforts to prevent its escape. A new threat appeared on Elena's scope. Taliban fighters with RPGs were positioning themselves for shots at the remaining helicopter. At 800 meters distance, she could clearly see them preparing their weapons, could see the devastating potential of allowing them to fire rocket-propelled grenades at the aircraft. Elena engaged the RPG teams with rapid, precise fire, eliminating the immediate threat before they could launch their weapons. The Taliban fighters scattered, some of them dropping their heavy weapons as they sought cover from her accurate shooting. The psychological effect was as important as the physical. The enemy fighters were learning that any attempt to threaten the helicopter would be met with immediate and deadly response. The radio crackled with updates from the helicopter crew. "Taking sporadic fire, but manageable. Loading the last of the assault team now." Elena could see soldiers boarding the aircraft while she continued to suppress enemy positions, her rifle cracking repeatedly as she engaged targets of opportunity. Morrison was tracking multiple threats simultaneously, his binoculars sweeping the surrounding terrain for signs of enemy movement. "Movement on the southern approach," he called out. "Looks like they're trying to get closer while we're focused on the other positions." Elena quickly shifted her attention to the new threat, identifying a group of Taliban fighters who were indeed attempting to use the distraction of the evacuation to close distance to the landing zone. She engaged them at approximately 900 meters, her shots forcing them to abandon their approach and seek cover behind rocks and vegetation. The second helicopter was finally ready to depart, its rotor spinning up to full power as it prepared to lift off with the remainder of the assault team. Elena maintained covering fire throughout the critical takeoff phase, knowing that helicopters were most vulnerable during the first few seconds of flight when they were slow and predictable targets. Taliban fighters made one final, desperate attempt to bring down the departing aircraft, emerging from concealed positions to fire AK-47s and machine guns at the helicopter as it gained altitude. Elena engaged every target she could acquire, her shots disrupting their aim and forcing them to take cover just as they were attempting to concentrate their fire on the aircraft. The helicopter climbed steadily through the storm, its lights disappearing into the low-hanging clouds as it followed the same route taken by the first aircraft. Elena watched it go with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. The impossible rescue had succeeded, and 8 American soldiers who had been trapped in the kill zone were now on their way to safety. But Elena and Morrison were still on the mountain, still surrounded by Taliban fighters who were undoubtedly angry about the successful extraction. The storm continued to rage around them, limiting visibility and making movement dangerous, but they couldn't remain in their current position indefinitely. Morrison was already preparing for their own extraction, coordinating with helicopter support that would need to return for them once the weather improved. But for now, they were alone on the mountain with an unknown number of enemy fighters who would be actively searching for the sniper team that had disrupted their ambush. Elena began packing her rifle while maintaining watch on the surrounding terrain. The immediate crisis was over, the assault team had been successfully evacuated, and the Taliban ambush had been broken.
But their own survival now depended on remaining undetected until weather conditions improved enough for helicopter extraction. The storm was beginning to show signs of weakening, with occasional breaks in the cloud cover that allowed glimpses of the surrounding mountains. Elena could see Taliban fighters moving through the area where the landing zone had been, probably searching for equipment or intelligence left behind during the hasty evacuation. Morrison had established contact with the command base and was coordinating their extraction. "Weather's supposed to clear in about 2 hours," he reported. "Extraction bird will be standing by once visibility improves." Elena nodded, knowing that 2 hours was a long time to remain undetected in enemy territory. They would need to find a better hiding place, somewhere they could remain concealed while waiting for their own rescue. The current position, while excellent for providing fire support, was too exposed for a prolonged stay.
Elena and Morrison began moving carefully through the storm, searching for a position that would provide both concealment and a defensive advantage while they waited for extraction. The Taliban fighters were actively patrolling the area now, clearly aware that a sniper team was responsible for the devastating precision fire that had broken their ambush. The terrain offered numerous hiding places among the rocky outcroppings and dense vegetation, but finding one that provided both concealment and escape routes was challenging. Elena's experience in mountain warfare guided their selection. They needed a position that couldn't be easily surrounded, that offered multiple exit routes, and that could be defended if they were discovered. After 30 minutes of careful movement, they found what appeared to be an ideal location, a small cave system that provided complete concealment from aerial observation while offering excellent fields of fire in multiple directions. The caves were large enough to accommodate their equipment while remaining invisible to casual observation. Elena established a defensive position while Morrison set up their communications equipment and began monitoring radio traffic. The news from the evacuated assault team was encouraging. All 8 soldiers had reached the coalition base safely, and Private Chen was receiving medical treatment for his wounds. The mission that had started as a disaster was being counted as a success due to the successful extraction of all personnel. But Elena and Morrison weren't safe yet. Through her scope, Elena could see Taliban fighters conducting organized searches of the area where the helicopter extraction had taken place. They were moving in small groups, checking every potential hiding place and clearly determined to find the sniper team responsible for disrupting their ambush. The storm was gradually weakening, which was both good and bad news for the stranded Americans. Improved weather would make helicopter extraction possible, but it would also make it easier for the Taliban fighters to spot their hiding place and coordinate attacks against their position. Morrison was monitoring weather reports and coordinating with helicopter crews that were standing by at the coalition base. "Ceiling's supposed to lift to about 500 feet in the next hour," he reported. "That should be enough for helicopter operations, but it also means better visibility for the bad guys." Elena continued to observe the Taliban search pattern, noting their tactics and trying to predict where they might search next. The enemy fighters were being methodical, checking each potential hiding place before moving to the next. At their current pace, they would reach Elena and Morrison's cave system within 2 hours, approximately the same time the helicopter extraction would become available. The timing was going to be critical. If the Taliban found their hiding place before the helicopter could reach them, Elena and Morrison would face overwhelming odds in a defensive battle. But if they tried to move to a new position, they risked being spotted during the movement and losing the advantage of their concealed position. Elena made the decision to remain in place and prepare for a possible defensive battle. The cave system offered excellent defensive advantages with multiple firing positions and limited approaches that could be easily covered. If they were discovered, they could potentially hold off a significant force long enough for helicopter extraction. Morrison was coordinating with the helicopter crews, providing detailed information about Taliban positions and movements that might threaten the extraction aircraft. The pilots would need to approach the landing zone while under potential fire from multiple directions, making this extraction as dangerous as the original rescue mission.
Through her scope, Elena continued to track the Taliban search teams. She could see that they were armed with a variety of weapons, including several RPGs that could pose a serious threat to any helicopter attempting an extraction. If shooting started, she would need to prioritize those RPG teams to protect the incoming aircraft. The radio brought updates on the approaching extraction. Extract bird is airborne, ETA 15 minutes. Weather is marginal but acceptable for operations. Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Help was on the way, but the next 15 minutes would determine whether they would be extracted safely or forced into a desperate firefight. Morrison was using his binoculars to scan the surrounding terrain, looking for the best approach route for the helicopter extraction while monitoring Taliban movements. "I count at least 12 enemy fighters in our immediate area," he reported. 3 RPG teams, multiple AK-47s, and what looks like a machine gun position. Elena was already calculating firing solutions for the various Taliban positions, prioritizing targets based on their threat to the helicopter extraction. She would have perhaps 30 seconds of surprise before the enemy fighters realized they were under attack and began returning fire. Those 30 seconds would need to be used with maximum effectiveness. The sound of helicopter rotors became audible in the distance, still muffled by the storm, but growing steadily louder. The helicopter extraction aircraft was approaching, and Elena knew that within minutes the Taliban fighters would detect the helicopter and begin preparing to engage it.
The sound of approaching helicopter rotors had an immediate effect on the Taliban search teams. Elena watched through her scope as enemy fighters abandoned their methodical search pattern and began moving toward positions that would give them clear shots at the extraction aircraft. The organized hunt for the sniper team had suddenly become a race against time to prevent another successful helicopter evacuation. Elena immediately began engaging the Taliban fighters who posed the greatest threat to the incoming helicopter. Her first shot eliminated the leader of an RPG team that was positioning itself on a ridge with a clear view of the planned landing zone. The remaining members of that team scattered, abandoning their heavy weapon as they sought cover from her accurate fire. Morrison was providing target information while coordinating with the helicopter crew via radio. "Multiple enemy positions around the LZ," he reported. "Sniper team is engaging threats now. Recommend high-speed approach from the northeast to minimize exposure." The helicopter pilot acknowledged the information and adjusted his approach accordingly, using the terrain features and remaining storm weather to mask his approach as much as possible. Elena could hear the aircraft getting closer, could visualize the crew preparing for what would likely be a dangerous extraction under fire. Elena systematically engaged Taliban positions, her shots designed to suppress enemy fire and protect the incoming helicopter, rather than necessarily eliminate every threat. She forced machine gun crews to abandon their positions, disrupted RPG teams before they could effectively engage the aircraft, and created enough chaos among the enemy forces to prevent organized resistance. The helicopter appeared through the storm clouds, flying fast and low as it approached the landing zone. Elena could see that it was the same type of aircraft that had successfully evacuated the assault team earlier, a testament to the courage of the helicopter crews who were willing to return to the same dangerous area to extract the sniper team. Taliban fighters immediately opened fire on the aircraft, their AK-47s and machine guns creating a deadly crossfire that the helicopter had to fly through to reach the landing zone. Elena engaged every enemy position she could acquire, her rifle cracking repeatedly as she tried to suppress the incoming fire. The helicopter pilot demonstrated exceptional skill, using terrain masking and evasive maneuvers to minimize his exposure while approaching the landing zone. Elena could see tracers streaking past the aircraft, could see the impacts of Taliban bullets on the helicopter's armored hull, but the pilot maintained his approach despite the hostile fire. Morrison was already preparing their equipment for rapid extraction, packing essential gear while leaving non-critical items behind to reduce weight and extraction time. Every second the helicopter remained on the ground would increase the danger to both the aircraft crew and the extraction team. Elena continued to provide covering fire as the helicopter settled into the landing zone, its rotors creating a dust storm that further reduced visibility for the Taliban fighters. She could see the crew chief gesturing for them to run to the aircraft while return fire from the helicopter's door guns suppressed nearby enemy positions. "Go, go, go," Morrison shouted over the noise of rotors and gunfire. Elena made a final scan of Taliban positions through her scope, engaging one more target before abandoning her rifle position and running toward the helicopter. The familiar weight of her M24 rifle felt reassuring as she sprinted across the rocky terrain toward safety. Taliban fighters intensified their fire as they realized their targets were escaping, bullets impacting around Elena and Morrison as they covered the final distance to the helicopter.
The crew chief provided cover fire with his door-mounted machine gun while reaching out to help them aboard the aircraft. Elena reached the helicopter first, throwing her rifle to the crew chief before hauling herself up into the aircraft. Morrison was right behind her, diving through the door as bullets sparked off the helicopter's armored plating. The crew chief was already signaling the pilot to lift off while continuing to return fire at Taliban positions. The helicopter lifted off immediately, its pilot using maximum power to gain altitude and distance as quickly as possible. Elena could feel the aircraft climbing steeply, could hear the engines straining against the storm winds as it carried them away from the hostile landing zone. Through the helicopter window, Elena could see Taliban fighters emerging from concealed positions, firing uselessly at the departing aircraft that was already beyond the effective range of their weapons. The extraction had been successful, but just barely. She could see new bullet holes in the helicopter's skin, evidence of how close they had come to disaster. The flight back to the coalition base took 30 minutes, during which Elena and Morrison received medical checks and debriefing from the helicopter crew. Both were uninjured despite their extended exposure to combat conditions, though exhausted from the physical and mental strain of the mission. As the helicopter approached the base, Elena could see the assault team members she had helped rescue gathered on the landing pad, waiting to welcome back the sniper team that had saved their lives. Private Chen was there too, his arm in a sling but obviously recovering from his wounds. The helicopter touched down safely, and Elena stepped out onto the familiar ground of the coalition base for the first time in 18 hours. The mission that had begun as a routine operation had become one of the most challenging and successful sniper engagements in military history.
The debriefing room at the coalition base was filled with senior officers, intelligence personnel, and ballistics experts who were struggling to understand exactly what had happened during Elena's unprecedented 4,000-meter shot. The mathematics were staggering, the environmental conditions had been extreme, and yet the impossible shot had found its target with lethal precision. Colonel Patterson, the base commander, was the first to speak as Elena entered the debriefing room. Master Sergeant Vasquez, what you accomplished today defies everything we know about the limitations of small arms fire. I need you to walk us through exactly how you made that shot. Elena took her seat at the conference table, surrounded by officers whose combined military experience spanned decades. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she understood the importance of documenting exactly what had happened for future training and tactical development. Sir, the shot at 4,000 meters was a combination of mathematical calculation, environmental assessment, and, honestly, a significant amount of luck, Elena began. The conditions were at the absolute edge of what's possible with the M24 system, and in normal circumstances, I wouldn't have attempted such a shot. The ballistics expert, a civilian contractor named Dr. Sarah Chen, leaned forward with interest. Master Sergeant, according to our calculations, a 7.62 millimeter bullet at that distance would have dropped over 200 feet and been subject to multiple wind layers. How did you account for those variables? Elena explained her calculation process, describing how she had estimated wind conditions at multiple altitudes, accounted for temperature differentials, and even factored in the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation. The assembled officers listened with amazement as she described mathematical calculations that most of them had never even considered. Morrison, who had been Elena's spotter throughout the mission, provided additional details about the environmental conditions and target acquisition process. The visibility was marginal, the wind was gusting unpredictably, and we were essentially firing at a target we could barely see, he reported. What Master Sergeant Vasquez accomplished was extraordinary by any measure. The intelligence officer, Major Williams, was particularly interested in the tactical impact of the shot. The elimination of the Taliban leader caused immediate confusion among the reinforcements and allowed the assault team to extract successfully, he noted. Without that shot, we would have lost 8 soldiers. Elena's company commander, Captain Rodriguez, not to be confused with the Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had led the assault team, was already thinking about the broader implications of the successful shot. This engagement is going to change how we think about long-range precision fire, he observed. We've just proven that shots previously considered impossible are actually achievable under the right circumstances.
Dr. Chen was taking detailed notes, clearly planning to analyze every aspect of the shot for future research and development. Master Sergeant, would you be willing to work with our team to develop new training protocols based on this engagement? What you've accomplished could revolutionize sniper training. Elena agreed to participate in the analysis, understanding that her experience could help save lives in future operations. But she was also careful to emphasize that the 4,000-meter shot had been attempted only because of the desperate circumstances faced by the trapped assault team. Colonel Patterson concluded the debriefing by announcing that Elena was being recommended for the Silver Star, the Army's third highest decoration for valor in combat. Master Sergeant Vasquez, your actions today exemplify the highest traditions of the United States Army. You've not only saved the lives of 8 soldiers, but demonstrated capabilities that will influence military tactics for years to come. The news of Elena's legendary shot spread quickly throughout the military community. Ballistics experts from around the world requested details of the engagement, sniper instructors incorporated the incident into their teaching materials, and military historians began documenting what they recognized as a watershed moment in the evolution of precision marksmanship. Elena herself remained characteristically modest about her achievement. In interviews with military journalists, she consistently emphasized the team nature of the operation and the courage of the helicopter crews who had risked their lives to complete the extractions. "I just did my job," she would say when asked about the record-breaking shot. The real heroes were the guys on the ground who fought their way out of that kill zone. But the military community understood the true significance of what Elena had accomplished. The 4,000-meter shot represented not just an exceptional individual achievement, but a demonstration of human potential when skill, training, and determination converged under extreme circumstances. It proved that the limitations of equipment could sometimes be transcended by the capabilities of the person using it. The Taliban commander who had been Elena's target was later identified through intelligence sources as Ahmed Shah Massoud, a regional leader responsible for coordinating attacks throughout the Kunar province. His death significantly disrupted Taliban operations in the area and likely saved many coalition lives in subsequent months. Years later, Elena's shot would still be studied in military academies and sniper schools around the world. The engagement became known as the Miracle of Kunar, though Elena preferred the simpler designation used by the soldiers whose lives she had saved, the shot that brought us home. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had led the trapped assault team, summed up the impact of Elena's marksmanship in his after-action report. "When we were trapped in that kill zone with Taliban reinforcements approaching, Master Sergeant Vasquez didn't just save our lives, she gave us hope. That shot from 4,000 meters away was our SOS answer, proof that no matter how desperate the situation, someone was watching over us." Elena Vasquez had entered military legend with a single bullet fired under impossible conditions, but her true legacy was measured not in distance or mathematical precision, but in the 8 American soldiers who returned home safely to their families because of her extraordinary skill and unwavering courage under fire.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.